Hello creatures, welcome back to Bound by Words. My name is Madie. If we haven't met yet, I am studying to become an editor alongside writing the first draft of my second manuscript, or as I like to say, my first good book, and sharing my journey and the stuff that I learned with you guys. So upon talking to some people both in the writing community and out of the writing community, it's come to my attention that not everyone knows exactly what it takes to write a book, and everyone knows the saying, it is a marathon, it's not a sprint. But what does that really mean? How much work are you actually into? If this is something you're interested in, then make sure you hit the subscribe button because I post writing related content every Monday. Alright, so today we are going over the publishing book writing process, and it is a very long and extensive process, and I think there are really two ends of it. And as an editing student, we had to learn the ins and outs of the process of traditional publishing in case we get contracted to do jobs like that. So I have gotten a very good understanding of how that stuff works lately, but there is a lot of stuff that comes before that. So everyone thinks like you finish a book, you find a literary agent, you find an editor, or if you're doing traditionally publishing, those things will be provided for you. But before you even get to the stage where you can think about querying your book, there is a lot to be done. So I generally think about publishing as a two-part job. The first part is to finish the book, to make it as beautiful and as amazing and flawless as you possibly can. And the second part is usually the publisher's responsibility, and that is the contract and the advance and designing the book cover and how the formatting is and proofreading and stuff like that. So we're not going to be talking about that second section today. Today we're going to be talking about the first section, but what you have to do to get a manuscript ready for publishing. And this is true if you're self-publishing or you're traditionally publishing, and it is also true whether you're writing novels or self-help books or nonfiction books. So step one, most people don't really think of this as a whole step, but step one is to write the book. That's a big step. That's a huge accomplishment. It is step one of many, to actually write and finish the book. And whether you are a writer who has to write and then go back and edit and then write more and go back and edit, or you're a writer who just writes everything up front and then goes back and edits whenever you're done, either way, you have to get an entire manuscript done. You have to write, you have to type the end, you have to get to the last page. That is step one. Whenever step one is over, you're now in the editing stage. And the editing stage, I would argue, is 80% or more of the work. If you want your book to be good, you actually have to put in all of the work and all of the effort to make it that polished manuscript. And your writing might be very solid and your concepts might be amazing in the first draft, but no first draft is a completed book. A lot of people make the mistake of writing a book and then going back through and touching up their typos and their grammatical problems and then immediately trying to query it, and there's a reason that is so tough and so discouraging, and it's because you're querying a book that hasn't actually been given the attention it deserves. So after you finish this first step of writing the book, you actually have to do several steps of editing afterwards. Now, how many steps you have to do is going to depend on how your manuscript looks and who you are as a writer, but generally you want to start with big, broad edits. You want to go back through your book that you've already written and you've already spent all of the time on smoothing out and building and putting together and filling in detail. You want to go back through that book that you've already poured all this time in and all this effort in building and piecing together and making diverse and wonderful. You want to go back through that and you want to evaluate some bigger picture things. You want to look at each part of the plot and say, is this necessary? Is this full of tension and suspense? Are my characters really being driven forward to act and to act on the plot? And is the plot acting back on them? You have to go through and you have to evaluate these things. And if you're doing something like nonfiction or self-help, you have to go through and make sure that whatever you're writing on is concise. If you have chapters or sections, do they all go together well? So you go back through and you do these very general edits where you just evaluate for holes, basically, because you don't want to spend all of your time on this book and then have some loophole where your protagonist could have won a lot easier if they would have just done this one thing that comes up in your book often, or your antagonist could have succeeded if they would have seen this other loophole happening. You want to be able to catch those things before you get close to the publishing process. So you do very big, broad edits, and then whenever you're done with those huge plot structure size broad edits, you want to go back through again and do smaller edits. You want to evaluate the character arcs. You want to evaluate where the chapters start and stop. You want to evaluate things like on a little bit more of a detailed scale. In this stage, it's not important the adjectives in the description, and it's not important the exact sentence structure. You're just looking at the general image of it all. And then when you're done with that, then you go back through and you say, okay, am I adding enough description? Is my dialogue believable? Do I have like the proper amount of adjectives? Is the setting described all in one chunk where it's hard to focus, or is it sprinkled throughout the book? You want to go through and look at those smaller things last. Now, those like 3 main stages of edits might take an author 10 drafts. Maybe you can multitask really well and it only takes you 2 or 3. But as the author and as the writer, you should write the complete manuscript and then rewrite it a few times. And rewriting isn't just touching up the typos and touching up the grammar. Rewriting is actually taking your story and reconstructing parts of it. And some parts of your story might be incredibly solid, but that doesn't mean every part is. And I've gotten the impression lately that this next part is optional. And it's really not. I can tell you that as somebody who has read books, both self-published and traditionally published, and somebody who is studying to be an editor, that is, you need beta readers. You need to polish your book as good as you can get it through those drafts and revisions and editing, and then you need to give it to somebody else, somebody who isn't you, and say, please read my book. Please tell me any loopholes you find. Please tell me areas where you really don't like the characters and why. Maybe your characters are supposed to be unliked at certain parts, but you still want to have the general sense that we are rooting for the protagonist, because if we aren't, then we're not going to want to finish reading the book. So you really have to give it to somebody else. And the reason for that is other people generally catch problems with writing that the author themselves can't really see because we're too close to the work and the writing. And another thing that a lot of writers do to combat this is whenever they're going through drafts, they usually let the manuscript sit for some amount of time in between each draft or in between big drafts, just so that they can forget some of the nitty-gritty details. For example, you just wrote the whole first draft, you're really invested, you have this whole solid manuscript, you sit it on the shelf for 2 months, and then you come back to it 2 months later and you start reading through it, and then you're picking up things from a reader's point of view and not a writer's point of view. So some people do that between every draft, some people do that between bigger drafts, but that's not always a fail-safe catch-all. You really have to let somebody else read it and give you feedback, and you have to be able to take that criticism well and with a grain of salt and really evaluate the things that people say, whether or not they have merit to them. So if somebody reads your book and they're really rude and they're just saying, oh, well, I hate this and I hate this and I hate this, it makes sense for you to not want to consider their criticism because it wasn't given out of their love for your story and making your story better. But if you have somebody that reads your book and they're like, look, I love the premise, it's really interesting, I really like the main character, but this one side character, like every time they talk, it gets under my skin, that might be something that you want to take note of and go back and revisit. So ideally, when it comes to beta reading, you want to have more than one person do it. And if you're very serious about making your book better, you might want to do it more than once. So you'll set your manuscript out to maybe 2, maybe 10, maybe 20 people, whatever you feel comfortable with. And then you get it back. And then whenever you get it back and you evaluate that criticism you've gotten on your manuscript, you go back through and you do another draft. You rewrite and you revise and you edit and you fix things accordingly, making another very polished draft. And then you send it out to beta readers again. Now, I would say doing this once is necessary. I don't think it's really optional at all. But if you can do it 2 or 3 times, the more the better. If you are really uncomfortable with sharing your work, maybe this is your first book and you're just not used to it, having one beta reader give you feedback is better than nothing. But if you want to publish, you're going to have to get used to people reading your book. So maybe to get yourself used to it, you have one person read it and give it back. And then after you have digested the stuff they say, you give it out to 3 people and then get it back. Maybe on the 3rd round, you give it out to 10 people. You can ease yourself into it, but I definitely think that you need to have other people reading your book. So after you do all of the revision and rewriting and beta reading and doing it over again, and you have the best book you think you can write, you have your manuscript, you have it formatted if you're like self-publishing, you're ready to query and do everything. Now, the next stage in the publishing process differs a little bit if you're doing self-publishing or traditional publishing, and that is to find an editor. So if you're doing self-publishing, self-publishing, you're going to want to pay a professional editor. Non-negotiable. If your book hasn't been edited, then it's not done. I had to go and get my book for emphasis, but this is the Chicago Manual of Style. If you are a self-published author and you do not get an actual paid editor, then you have all this information that you should know to format your book. If you don't have any intention of reading through this and seeing all of the grammar rules and word usage rules, and there's even rules for what kind of hyphens and dashes and stuff that you should use where, when do you put page numbers and where, there are rules for all of that. So if you have no intention of learning this like the back of your hand, then you really need to pay an editor to look at your book. And you don't have to pay an expensive editor, but you do need to have somebody who's very familiar with, this is the Chicago Manual of Style. If you're publishing in the US, this is the book that most publishing houses use, and almost every novel is written in this format. You have to hire somebody who knows this. If you are traditionally publishing, your job now is to find a literary agent. And what your literary agent's going to do is they're going to help you sell your book to a traditional publishing company. Whenever you get a contract offer from a publishing company, they will assign you an editor who knows this. So you don't have to worry about finding somebody. They will assign it, they will pay for it. All you have to worry about is what comes next, and that is working with the editor. So what's going to happen is you're going to give your precious little book baby over to somebody who knows this book, and you're going to get it back with redlining all over it. You're going to get it back with corrections, and some of the corrections are just going to be like, hey, you put a comma here and you really should put a period, or hey, I had to change this kind of hyphen because you used the wrong one. Some of them are just going to be logistical formatting stuff, and some of them are going to be things like, hey, this word you used is really misleading. Hey, there's this plot hole in the story and I would make this suggestion to change it. Your editor, though, should always be very professional and kind and courteous to you, so if they are not, find another editor. But that being said, you're going to have some tough conversations if you have some parts of your book that really need growth, and it is your editor's job to say, hey, this is something I would really recommend fixing, and you should be able to have that conversation. So be prepared for that, because whenever you're done with your professional edit and you get your redline manuscript back, you're going to have to make all those changes. So if you have a good editor, they're not just going to go through and make changes. They're going to make suggestions on your document. They're probably going to use something like Word with track changes where comments and stuff pop up, and you have to go through every single individual instance where they made a suggestion, even if it's a formatting thing that isn't really a suggestion. Like you used a comma but it needs to be a period. That's not really a suggestion, but they'll mark it on the document like that, and you'll have to accept or reject every suggestion. So if you have like a really wordy sentence and the editor is like, hey, I think this is a much more concise sentence to use, but then you're thinking, oh, my protagonist is really disoriented there, I want it to be wordy, I want to give the impression that they're really emotionally struggling, you can reject that change. You have the power to do that as the author, and nobody's going to tell you can't, because it is your book and your author dreams weigh out on everybody else. But your editor should really just be trying to help you. So don't feel personally attacked if they say, hey, I would change this sentence, it's vague, or hey, I don't understand what you mean here. They're saying that because they want to help you make your book clear and concise for publishing. So usually that happens at least once. Once is kind of ideal, but in situations where you get your edit back and you have to make some big changes, maybe you have to add a whole new 5 pages, then you're going to want to send at the very least the new stuff that you write back to the editor, and they're going to re-edit those 5 pages and send them back to you again for adjustments. So you want to make sure through the entire process, especially if you're doing it with a publishing company, you want to be very clear on what the deadlines are and what kind of opportunities you have. Are you going to have more than one edit? Is it going to be a dire situation only kind of thing? Because whenever they buy your book, they buy it as is. So they might only have time for you to do one edit. If you are self-publishing, you don't really have this problem because you can go back and forth with the editor as many times as you want, but stuff like that does add up a little bit. So you have your book, you have edited it yourself several times, you've had your beta readers, and then you've rewritten it, and then you've maybe done it again, and you've rewritten it, and you had this polished story that you gave to an editor to destroy, and they absolutely destroyed it and gave it back. Now you accepted or rejected all of your changes, and you have this perfect little story baby. What happens next? Well, if you are in self-publishing, you're going to want to hire a proofreader. You can proofread yourself. Proofreading is a lot easier than copy editing, but you are going to have to do a little bit of research. If that's something you want to do yourself, I recommend taking a class. A lot of companies offer classes on just how to do certain little aspects of editing. You can take them through the EFA. I know Chicago University, where I'm going to school now, they offer online classes, so you can very easily take their beginner's course in manuscript editing and learn how to do that. But you're either going to want to hire a proofreader, or if you're traditionally publishing, you will be appointed a proofreader. And what your proofreader is going to do is they're going to look at your book in its finished binding, either the actual physical book with the binding on it, or a PDF that's going to be exactly what the book prints out for. They're going to make sure all your page numbers are right. They're going to read through your work one more time and make sure nothing was spelled wrong, all changes were either accepted or rejected, and the ones that were rejected aren't going to cause any issues like grammar or punctuation issues. They're going to make sure your front matter and your back matter are all included in the right order and numbered, and those are things like your table of contents and the copyright page and your acknowledgments if you have any. Things like that. They're going to make sure all of that's in there and squared away. They're going to make sure your title is written and spelled correctly. And normally, by the time you're at the proofreading stage, you already have a cover designed. Whether you paid to have it designed or your publishing company paid to have it made, you're going to have somebody read through that title, because the last thing you want is a typo on your cover that sends such a bad image to your readers. So there is only one more thing to do before it is safe to publish your book and put it on the shelf. And it's, some people would argue, optional, but I would highly encourage you as the author to pick your book up and read it one more time. Because say you publish it and you don't touch it, and then 5 years later you pick it up and you read it and you're like, oh man, I described that one thing wrong, or oh man, I put the wrong character's name and nobody else caught it. You want to read through as the author who knows the story and knows the world one more time and just make sure that you're happy with what you're putting on the shelf, because your name's going to be on it. Your editor's name is not going to be on it. Your publisher's name is just going to be a little icon in the binder, a little line in the copyright page. Whenever you pick up books, no one really pays attention as much to those things as they do the cover image, and they do the author's name. To be entirely honest, some of my favorite authors, I couldn't tell you what publishing house they were published through. I don't really care either, to be honest. What I care is that their name is on it, and I know that they wrote it, and I know that I'm going to like it. So after all of that, I would feel totally okay personally putting a stamp of approval on the book and have it be published and sitting out on the shelf. And I don't say any of this to scare anybody. If you're sitting down with your first manuscript, this can be really daunting sounding, and it can be really scary thinking about how much work is ahead of you. But writing is a hobby that a lot of people enjoy. And if you're sitting down with your first book and you're thinking, you know what, this would be cool to get published, but for now I'm just writing for fun, just write for fun. Don't worry about it. Don't stress about it. But if you do want to be published and you're really set on that goal, just be aware of what it takes, because you don't want to cut corners. You don't want to think, well, oh, I'm only going to need to write 2 drafts, and then maybe you put out work that's half as good as it could have been. Maybe you put out an okay story that could have been this year's #1 bestseller if it had 3 more drafts. You really want to make sure that you put your all into something that is being published. But with that, I have faith that you guys will give your book babies the love they need, because most of you guys that are writing, it's because you really love your story. So don't skimp out on your story. Go the whole way. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment down below with what the publishing process has looked like for you. Are you finished with your draft? Are you on draft 3? Are you in the middle of beta readers? Did you just get a book deal? I want to hear about it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video or learned anything, make sure you hit the subscribe button. I post writing related videos every Monday.